human babies underwater. Instinctively, they swim. They know how to hold their breath. They're perfectly relaxed, and body fat keeps them afloat. They seem to be at home in the water. None of the great apes at this age can swim, float, and hold their breath. How can humans? Why can they? Where did this natural intimacy with water come from? The answer to that might also be the answer to another question. Where did humans come from? The hot, dry savannas of Africa. Water here is precious, and for most of the year, nothing but an illusion. The conventional wisdom is that this flat, dry place is where, millions of years ago, human evolution began. For the past 75 years, this has been the stage for a quest to find exactly how humanity began. This search for our origins has been a long and bloody battle. Careers and reputations have been built and demolished with each new discovery, but each one redrawing the controversial path from ape to human. One extraordinary attempt originated far away from the African continent. Here, in the valleys of South Wales, is the home of Elaine Morgan, successful writer and television dramatist, housewife and grandmother. More than 30 years ago, she began to doubt the traditional accounts of our origins.
In the 1960s, almost all the anthropologists believed that the human race was descended from a branch of the apes that left the forests and went out and lived on the savannah. The more I thought about this, the more I felt they had to have it wrong. It didn't explain why, of all the animals on the savannah, we are the only ones that walked on two legs, we're the only ones that had naked skins, the only ones that had fat babies. It didn't explain why we went out there in the first place, and I thought there must be a better explanation than that.
The terraced streets of an old Welsh mining village are an unlikely setting for a housewife to confront the scientific establishment. Elaine Morgan is a writer, not a scientist, but she felt strongly that something was missing from the orthodox explanations of our past.
When you think of the dozens of different ways in which we differ from the other apes, the way we breathe, the way we look, our skin, the way we walk, these cannot all be accounted for by saying they crossed open spaces of grass between the trees. Most of these features have parallels among aquatic animals. I believe they passed through a period of living in a semi-aquatic environment, and this was what set us on the road to becoming fully human.
What no one disputes is this: humans are originally African and an indirect result of a literally earth-shattering event, the Great Rift. A split in the planet's crust that runs from the Middle East southwards almost to South Africa. It started 20 million years ago, when great volcanoes began to prise the continent apart. The volcanoes spewed ash into an ever-growing valley. As this valley widened, great lakes appeared. Then, about 5 million years ago, the continental upheaval slowed down and the African climate changed. It became drier, and volcanic ash fed growing plains, a process that has led to the savannas of today. The great forest shrank into an ever smaller area. Some species of apes clung to these shrinking habitats. But one had a different history. Between 15 and 20 million years ago, there existed an ape that was the ancestor of all today's African apes and humans. The human line split off. Only by understanding when this event happened will we be able to know how humans first evolved. In the 1960s, there was no shortage of explanations. Perhaps chimpanzee-like apes came down to explore the forest floor in search of new food, grew large brains, and then stood upright to free their hands for tools. Perhaps they then moved out to hunt on the plains of the savannah. They became carnivorous, tool-using creatures that walked on two legs. But there had been little hard evidence to support these ideas. Over the years, the search for a clearer picture of this sequence of events became the anthropologist's holy grail. It was in 1871 that Charles Darwin rocked society by suggesting that humans shared an origin with the African apes. It was, at the time, an outrageous idea. But it wasn't until 1925, in South Africa, that fossil evidence in support of Darwin's suggestion finally came to light. Anatomy professor Raymond Dart described an ape-like juvenile skull from a cave beyond the southern end of the Rift Valley. He called it Australopithecus africanus, a creature with a small head that sat on top of its spine as our own skulls do. That meant it probably walked on two legs, a bipedal ape. It was hailed as the missing link between us and the rest of the primates. But Professor Dart saw something more. Found alongside the skull were smashed and broken bones of other animals, evidence, he believed, of our ancestors' killer instincts. Dart, a charismatic scientist, demonstrated his theory in a 1960s interview.
The Australopithecines particularly liked the lower jaws of animals that had long canine teeth, because these could be used as formidable weapons. And you can see how, with a weapon like this, they could gouge out the eyes of any animal. And even this primitive hyena jaw could rip up a belly.
Dart put all this evidence together to deliver his startling conclusion. Our ancestors were aggressive and carnivorous killer apes, and weapons made of bones and horns were the key to their success. In the years that followed, many scientists then built on Dart's theory. They concluded that it must have been life on the open savanna that shaped our ancestors and caused them to take on the characteristics of modern humans. Big brains, long striding legs, naked skin. This view of human origins has become known as the Savannah theory. On the Savannah, it was argued, these ancestors found a habitat with new challenges and new predators. Strength in numbers may have allowed them to scavenge the kills of others. So a picture began to emerge of a creature with newfound weaponry and a growing intelligence, roaming the African plains in packs, upright with spears in hand. Dart's killer ape theory of our origins became the popular image of man the hunter. This Savannah idea was so universally accepted, it became scientific currency for almost 40 years. But our ancestors weren't the only primates to have left the trees. So why, and this was the key question, why were they the only savanna mammal that habitually walked on two legs? Elaine Morgan's answer to this was that sometime after the human line split from the apes, and before they took to the savannah, they adapted to living in water. In water, they would have had to stand up.
If a primate is going into water and the water is rising up to its chest, it cannot walk on four legs with its head down, or it would drown. All primates, if they're in a situation where they need to cross water will stand up on their hind legs, and not only stand on them but walk on two legs.
It was an extraordinary idea that upright walking evolved in water. Elaine Morgan, as an amateur scientist, was sticking her neck out, but freedom to express radical views was the order of the day. The late 60s were a time when many traditionally held beliefs were under attack, a time of rebellious people with rebellious ideas, including ideas about the mysteries of the past. Meanwhile, other people were taking the conventional wisdom and pushing it a little further, popularizing it. Desmond Morris.
One of the things I looked at in The Naked Ape was the relationship between the human male and the human female. I'd argued that there was a division of labor, with males hunting and females gathering food. Some people looked upon this as a very pro-male approach, the mighty hunter theory, some people called it.
Elaine Morgan called it that. She found the accepted accounts of human evolution intellectually weak and sexist. As a mother with young children, she instinctively understood the problems our ancestors may have faced, and she tried to imagine the life of a small two-legged female struggling to survive on the African savannah. If our ancestors had taken to walking on two legs, how did they cope with the burden of more than one child, especially if they were a naked ape? Elaine Morgan thought that a savannah full of hunting males was only half the picture, and in 1972 began to publicly challenge the popular image of man the hunter.
I think up until now all the answers have been wrong and inadequate. Most of them have hinged around the theory that man was the carnivorous ape who came from the trees to the savannah, and the male became a mighty hunter, and a killer and a weapon wielder, and the female became a parasite and a sexual object. And this is supposed to explain all the differences between ourselves and the other apes. It doesn't explain them, it's inadequate, it contains dozens of inconsistencies, it leaves dozens of questions unanswered. I believe it has only held for so long because it gives a great boost to the male ego. They like to think of themselves as this mighty hunter, this Tarzan figure, swinging through the jungle and spearing animals.
But there was one idea in Desmond Morris's book that did appeal to Elaine Morgan, an idea that he had picked up from an Oxford scientist, Sir Alister Hardy, working a long way from the African continent.
He first had the idea for the aquatic ape theory when he came back from a voyage on the Discovery. He'd been out looking at marine mammals, and when he got back, he picked up a book, and in it said, "We do not know why man has a layer of fat under the skin." And he thought, I know why we've got it. It's blubber. He'd just been looking at blubber, and it was one of those eureka moments when he said, of course, human beings have blubber. They must have been aquatic. And in that moment, the idea was born.
It was a revolutionary thought, but one that at the time had no chance of being accepted. And Hardy had an academic career to pursue.
Well, that was nearly 60 years ago. It seems so preposterous, though. I kept it dark. I wanted to become a fellow of the Royal Society. I couldn't do that, holding the aquatic ape theory. And so, quite candidly, I kept it smothered up.
He sat on his theory for nearly 30 years. When he did finally publish, he was ignored. The story might have ended there, but in Wales, Elaine Morgan had no scientific reputation to protect.
When I first read about Hardy's ideas, I thought they were brilliant. I couldn't believe that people had ignored them for the last 10 years. I was thinking about writing a book about evolution from the women's angle and calling it The Descent of Woman, a sort of analogy with Darwin's Descent of Man. And I asked Hardy if he would allow me to use his ideas in the book, and he was quite enthusiastic.
As a dramatist with a growing career as a BBC scriptwriter, Elaine Morgan turned these skills to popular science writing. She gathered together all the books she could find on the subject and began to list all the differences between humans and the apes. The result was Elaine Morgan's first book. It poked fun at the male-centered view of evolution and was an immediate sensation, and she traveled overseas to promote it. Across the USA, she was an instant media celebrity, moving from station to station on television and radio chat shows.
We're back, and our guest is Elaine Morgan, who is the author of The Descent of Woman.
Our guest on Meet the Newsmaker this week is Elaine Morgan, a housewife from Wales, who's created a stir in the literary and anthropological worlds with her book, The Descent of Woman. It's probably the first book that deals with a woman's viewpoint of evolution.
She met the leading feminists of the day, and using the same provocative and humorous style of her book, she made fun of the sexist images of our history and taunted the male-dominated world of science.
I think it's to even them out a little, yeah.
The message of her book was clear. Women were equal partners with men in our evolutionary past, and the key to that past was water. In The Descent of Woman, Elaine Morgan claimed that humans once lived, ate, and reproduced in water. She believed that this aquatic phase was the missing link in our past. Like sea mammals, but unlike all land mammals, we developed an insulating fat layer and lost most of our hair. The hair that did remain appears to follow the flow of water as it passes over our bodies, while the hair on the head would have provided a handhold for the infants to cling on to. And if they let go, that was no problem. They could hold their breath underwater or float on the surface. The story seemed to make sense, but how was it received?
After Elaine had published The Descent of Woman, there was a long period of silence. Nothing much happened. The academic reaction to Alistair's theory and to Elaine's promotion of it was simply to ignore it.
Those who did comment claimed that it was all too far-fetched. Most studies of wild primates had indicated that they kept well away from water.
One objection to the aquatic ape theory is that people say primates are afraid of water. But in the first place, if they can get anything out of the water, if they need to cross water, they will wade across it. If they can get food from it, they will wade in it.
In the 1960s, few primates were known to live in association with water. But in the flooded forests and mangrove swamps of Borneo lives the proboscis monkey. This primate not only wades from tree to tree, but is also a strong swimmer and can even swim underwater. But anthropologists had their minds on more important things than the fanciful theories of a Welsh housewife. They were finding their Savannah people. In South Africa and later East Africa, Australopithecus fossils had been turning up steadily since the 1930s. Then in 1974, in Ethiopia, in the northern part of the Great Rift Valley, they unearthed what they believed to be our oldest ancestor. Leading anthropologist Don Johansen tells the story.
We picked up a piece of the skull. It was obvious that it couldn't be from anything except a hominid. And then we saw other pieces that just were almost like they were popping out of the sediments, but yet they were there the whole time. And we both looked at one another and we said, it really looks like it's it. And what we meant by it was a skeleton.
Johansen and his team had found something extraordinary. A fossil hominid with a small ape-like skull similar to the one described by Raymond Dart. They called her Australopithecus afarensis and nicknamed her Lucy. She walked upright, with a pelvis and knee almost like a modern human's, but like other apes, she had a small brain. This showed that two-leggedness had evolved long before large brains and tool-making. And Lucy told us something more. The split from apes was thought to have taken place 15 to 20 million years ago, but Lucy, dated by potassium-argon decay rates, was placed at about 3 million years old. If the Lucy fossil was a two-legged link between modern humans and the apes, then the split was much more recent than anyone imagined, just over 5 million years ago. Johansen and his team claimed the human family tree needed to be redrawn, and that started another big anthropological debate. Then, a few years later, Johansen's claims were supported by the famous fossil hunter Mary Leakey, who made a further sensational discovery. She found, preserved in a bed of volcanic ash, the fossilized footprints of 3 of these early ancestors. 2 appeared to be walking side by side, with another following in the footsteps of the others. Dated at 3.6 million years old, this was clear evidence that a human ancestor was walking on 2 legs. The path from ape to human was becoming clearer. There was now some order to the sequence of events that shaped humanity. Walking upright, rather than being the final step in the transition from ape to human, had come first. This was the moment when human history began, and scientists now had to ask what made early humans first stand up. Elaine Morgan seized upon this new evidence to support her own explanations.
Well, the discovery of Lucy transformed the whole picture, and I was very happy about it. For one thing, she wasn't found on the arid savanna. She was found in quite lush and leafy surroundings. For another thing, she was found in the north. It's a part of Africa which was subject to extensive sea flooding, and Lucy's fossil was discovered near the edge of what had been that inland sea.
Along the length of the African Rift Valley is a chain of great lakes, and beside these lie some of the oldest fossil sites. But go back 6 million years, and there was extensive sea flooding over parts of northern Africa. This rise in sea level overwhelmed the Danakil area to the north, leaving only one island of high ground, the Danakil Alps. If the first human fossil sites do date back to the time when the ancient sea covered areas of northeast Africa, could it have been along these shores that the first humans evolved? Elaine Morgan thinks so.
If they were isolated on that island, that would explain how they had separate development, proceeding very rapidly without any interbreeding with the land apes.
A new discipline, molecular biology, was revolutionizing how we studied our evolutionary history. Away from the fossil sites, scientists were beginning to reconstruct the past without reference to a single fossil. There is a library of information hidden in our genes. With this new source of evidence, scientists were able to pinpoint the split from apes, not from bone fragments, but from DNA. What they found was that the split happened about 5 million years ago, shortly before the time of Lucy and of the fossil footprints. So all the evidence, the climate, the fossils, and the genetics were combining to paint a new picture of an ape-like ancestor who took to 2 legs, lived near water, and hadn't been around nearly as long as one thought. Soon it was revealed that they weren't nearly as bloodthirsty either. The killer ape ideas that had originated with Raymond Dart were challenged by South African scientist Bob Brain.
It was such a wonderfully forceful argument that he put forward for the killer ape, you know, and suggesting that at that time, even 2-3 million years ago, that our ancestors were powerful hunters, able to kill virtually any animal in the environment, to bring their bones back to the caves where they ate them, and where they selected some of the bones for tools and weapons.
Bob Brain's interpretation was very different, though. The ape ancestor was not so much the killer as the victim. What he found in abundance were the skulls, teeth, and other bones of ape men, baboons, and antelopes. Many skulls had clear bite marks that matched the fossil teeth of saber-toothed cats and other large carnivores of the time. Our first ancestors, the Australopithecines, were not the hunters, but the prey. While this new evidence didn't contradict her theory, at home in Wales, Elaine Morgan had almost given up her struggle in support of the aquatic ape theory. Then she received an unexpected boost.
I hadn't intended to write any more about the subject, but then, after about 7 or 8 years, I began getting letters from an American policeman who was very keen on the idea. He thought I should write more, and also he had written to all kinds of famous and important people in the field, asking them what they thought of it. And he sent me copies of their letters. And the one thing that came across was, although they disliked it very much, there didn't seem any very clear reasons given why they disliked it, and certainly nothing which proved to me that I was wrong.
Like Elaine, Chuck Millikan was not a specialist, just a layman with an inquiring mind, someone not afraid to ask questions. But each of his letters was met with a similar response from scientists: fantasy, over-fertile imagination. He sent these on to Elaine Morgan, and this wholesale rejection inspired Elaine to write a new book. It was published in 1980. This time she avoided the distracting humor and feminism of The Descent of Woman and took the Savannah theory head-on. She believed the missing link between apes and humans could not logically have lived on a savanna.
The kind of questions that the Savannah theory was completely failing to answer were particularly questions to do with the soft tissue, like the skin, the fat and the flesh. They're unable to explain why we're the only savanna animal to have lost its fur, and why we're the only savanna animal to have got layers of fat under the skin.
But people most familiar with these features were medical scientists, and one was already publishing papers showing how different we were from other savanna animals.
The anthropologists have a quite different view on this. They see only the bones and they find them in dry environments, but as a doctor you have to deal with living people. You see the soft tissues, you see the fat and the hair and all these problems and these resemblances with sea mammals. Of course, when I speak for doctors, they are always much more open to this aquatic theory than anthropologists are.
Savannah theorists explained it like this: perhaps growing fat and losing fur might be a compromise to regulate body temperature on the hot savanna. The aquatic ape supporters claimed that in air, hair is a far better insulator than fat and gives protection from the hot rays of the sun. Fat is a far better insulator in water and would only slow down an animal living in an open habitat. Fat and nakedness both appear to be poor savanna adaptations. The only other fat, hairless mammals are found in waterholes and rivers. So is human fat, like the blubber of aquatic animals, a way of keeping warm in water? Many anthropologists, including Adrian Zillman, think the aquatic ape theory makes too much of this. Many anthropologists, including Adrian Zillman, think the aquatic ape theory makes too much of this.
Where humans deposit their fat is where all other mammals deposit their fat, including monkeys and apes. What's different about humans compared to other primates is that we have slightly more body fat, but we have it exactly in the same places and have the same pattern.
The difference in the amount of fat may be slight in human adults, but in babies it's marked. Unlike all other primates, which are born with almost no body fat, human babies are born with plenty of it.
Fat is a specific evolutionary development. It's not just a punishment for eating too much. A human child spends longer in the womb than a chimp does, and the whole of the last month is spent accumulating fat. And after it's born, it gets fatter and fatter and fatter for the whole of its first 12 months on Earth. There must be some good reason for this.
And Elaine Morgan thinks there is. Fat does something more than insulate. It provides buoyancy. And if we did have an aquatic past, this ability to float with ease may be the reason for all that baby fat. There's another odd thing about humans: breath control. For land mammals, the lungs pump the way the heart beats, unconsciously. But humans, like aquatic mammals, can make this process conscious if they want to. They can estimate how much breath is needed for a dive and how long they need to hold it. That makes humans able to do what no other primate can: control precisely the flow of air over a voice box. So a former life in the water could even explain the evolution of language. Humans stand up and they speak. In the mid-1980s, Elaine Morgan finally made an inroad into the academic world by getting a series of articles published in reputable scientific magazines. She couldn't be entirely ignored now, but agreed with? Not widely.
It's a bizarre idea. There's a problem with the hypothesis because I think that the aquatic ape brings up in people's mind the idea of apes dog paddling around in lakes or in oceans. And this is a very bizarre adaptation. And there isn't any evidence, to my mind, in the fossil record that would support an adaptation like this.
For fossil specialists such as Lee Berger, the arguments weren't even scientific.
The problem with the aquatic ape hypothesis is the way it's argued. We scientists are always going to be the bad guys in this one. We're arguing against people who are almost pursuing this as if it's a religion. If we say it's not, well, it's a scientific conspiracy. If we tell you that the morphology of the bones are not suitable for exhibiting any ancestry of an aquatic organism, well, it's a scientific conspiracy. We're not open to new ideas. It's not that good of an idea. It's not based on testable scientific philosophy.
Elaine was looking at the fossil evidence, though, just from a different angle. She saw bones that enabled an animal to stand up, a wading ape that could walk on two legs in water or on land. There are nearly 200 species of monkeys and apes in the world, and only one habitually, exclusively, walks upright. Why? What's the advantage?
Walking bipedally does make you much more slow and much more awkward. It means that you're more susceptible to predation because you don't have the speed and agility of a quadruped. It also means that you're relying on only two limbs to support your body mass where you used to rely on four. This increases the load on your hind limbs. It makes you more prone to injury. It makes your skeleton more prone to degradation. In general, it's just a very, very poor way of locomoting.
Scientists did have their own explanations, almost all linked to the climatic change that pushed our ancestors out from the forest and into the savannah. One early suggestion was that by standing upright, our ancestors could look high above the grass in search of potential predators, as many savanna animals do. But it's still much faster to run on four legs. Or maybe the upright posture is the result of reaching for food in the low savanna trees. Or even better, by having their hands free, these ape-like ancestors could then carry more food home to feed mates and children. A more recent explanation is that standing upright evolved as a cooling strategy. Less of the body is exposed to the overhead rays of the midday sun. And there's another way that standing tall keeps you cool. Savannah physiologist Peter Wheeler demonstrates his theory.
I've just set up two identical temperature sensors here. The one on the left has been placed close to the ground surface in the shade, and the right-hand one some 6 feet above it in this small acacia bush, also in the shade. And as we can see, there's some considerable difference in the readings of the two sensors. The one near the ground is reaching temperatures of almost 20 degrees centigrade higher than the more elevated one. What bipedalism is doing is it's moving more of the body surfaces further away from that hot ground and placing them in these cooler and faster moving airstreams where more heat will be carried away from the body by the process of convection.
So, according to Wheeler, by standing up, we kept cool. These explanations clearly dealt with the advantages of life in the savannah, but there were also drawbacks.
It's not only the uprightness, there are all these other things like the nature of our sweat glands, the nature of our perspiration, the chemistry of it. All of these strange, odd things which you wouldn't give a sniff to normally could indeed be valuable pointers to a kind of aquatic component in human evolution.
If our ancestors did move from forest to savannah, they needed to adapt to a hot, dry, exposed environment. Yet humans need to drink far more than any savannah animal. We also sweat far more than any savannah animal. We produce dilute urine, and we die quickly if we overheat. All these qualities contrast strongly with every other savannah animal. In 1990, Elaine brought the story up to date once more. And then, while the search for fossil bones continued, there came another dramatic twist to the story. Scientists looking at fossil plants found alongside the bones of South African ape men uncovered startling new evidence. It showed that at the time our ancestors were supposed to have first stood up, they lived in wooded and even forested habitats, not in the savannah. Much of what savannah supporters had based their ideas on would now need to be reassessed.
I was brought up on the idea that savannah was the ideal background within which uprightness emerged for the first time on the planet among the primates who became us. And it was a fixed idea for decades. Now it seems that that idea is just not correct.
The main counter-argument to the aquatic ape theory that humankind was born in the savannah was losing support.
This was a tremendous boost for the aquatic theory because there is nothing else really taking its place. The only theories they are talking about now is that perhaps when the apes were crossing the open spaces between one clump of trees and another clump of trees, perhaps that caused them to be different. That's only a watered-down version of the savannah theory. The savannah theory is dead. You've got to get something to put in its place, and the aquatic ape theory is the only game in town.
If one testable scientific hypothesis, like the savannah hypothesis, is out the window because we found provable evidence that these ape men lived in forested environments, that doesn't have any relationship to the aquatic ape hypothesis.
Being the only explanation around didn't make it right. If she was to be taken seriously, Elaine Morgan had to meet the scientists head-on and present her arguments in their language. The internet put scientists all over the world into instant touch with each other, and the aquatic ape was one subject that could be relied upon to provoke fierce debate.
What I learned from the internet was I could gather all the little objections they had been raising behind closed doors that I hadn't known about, and I thought I will write a new book. I will jack up my scholarship, I will agree with their specifications, I will answer their objections, and I will bring it all up to date, and this time perhaps they will take it seriously.
The result was her latest book, published in 1997 in Elaine Morgan's 77th year. And then, a few months later, a breakthrough. An invitation to South Africa's Sun City resort to speak at an international scientific conference on human origins. All the world's experts on human evolution would be there.
It's very exciting. I think it's very gratifying to have even a toehold in a conference this size, and it'll be a thrill to see many of the people whose books I have read, see them in the flesh and see what they look like. I doubt if there'll be much head-to-head argument, but at least my voice will have been heard, I hope.
After all Elaine Morgan had written about Africa and its fossil sites, this was her first visit to either. She went on a conference day trip to see firsthand the labors of the fossil hunters. She touched the bones of our past and discovered how much the rest of the world knew of her ideas.
I think there is a lady who insists that the ancestor of the humans was in water.
Yes, that's me.
You? Ah, you are the... Yes.
And then, after 30 years of studying the evidence from afar, Elaine Morgan now walked in the footsteps of the celebrated fossil hunters.
It's amazing how they recognized its significance, and that little hole that they must have gone down from before it got chipped away. Some depth.
Back at Sun City, Elaine needed to summon her own courage as the moment to present her ideas came. 30 years of rejection, and now, finally, she had the stage.
Ladies and gentlemen, it was in 1960 that Professor Alistair Hardy first put forward his ideas on human evolution. He suggested that there might have been an aquatic phase in human evolution, or semi-aquatic, at the time when we split from the apes, and that this might explain why we are so different from them.
This was the beginnings of acceptance. The talk was, of course, controversial, and the debate lively.
Undoubtedly of ignorance, I cannot figure out a way of testing it.
No, I think that the aquatic theory is no more accessible to testing and finding definite...
You know that there are two ways that ideas are treated in science in general. If you don't like a new idea, and nobody liked the aquatic ape theory when Sir Alistair Hardy put it forward, they thought it was a bit of a crackpot, harebrained sort of notion, you either vehemently oppose it, or you just ignore it, as though nobody had ever said it.
The promotion of the idea often wastes a great number of resources, maybe takes bright young future scientists in a different direction by giving it some validity. I know that sounds harsh, but it's not intended to be as harsh as it sounds. It's just that there are so many good questions, so many important questions, so many scientific questions, and I'm not sure that this is one of them that's worth wasting those resources on.
But a growing number of scientists now believe the aquatic ape idea does raise important questions. Questions that may be answered not by looking at the bones of fossils or the biology of our bodies, but in the food we once ate.
Homo sapiens evolved this large brain, because he found an ecological niche. He found an environment where he could get at these essential nutrients. He found the lake shores, he found the sea, he found the estuaries, where the brain evolved right at the very first beginning in the marine environment. And we still owe a debt of gratitude in terms of its chemistry to that environment. Homo sapiens found that.
The only other mammals with brains as large and sophisticated as ours are marine mammals. What does that say about the marine mammal's diet? Do you need a large brain to exploit seafood, or does seafood give you a large brain?
We had a pre-existing capacity for intelligence being primates, and some of our ancestors managed to stumble upon mussels and fish, and in the Rift Valley you can catch fish by hand by spears. They get stranded during the end of the rainy season. It's very easy to make use of these resources. We stumbled upon it when we weren't smart enough to know how to hunt or fish or do anything. Ate enough of these essential fatty acids, got our brains a little bigger so we could say, hey, this is a good idea, let's do it again and again and again. Enough generations do it, enough infants are born with the brain capacity passed on through the mother that we can evolve very, very quickly to be intelligent and basically leave the Australopithecines behind.
So early humans were somehow intimate with water. They either used the life in it or were part of the life in it. As time has passed, Elaine Morgan has been vindicated. She hasn't been proved right. She isn't even supported by a majority of anthropologists. But she's recognized, and her ideas are sparking other ideas.
I see Elaine Morgan, through her series of superbly written books, presenting a challenge to the scientists to take an interest in this thing, to look at the evidence dispassionately, not to avert your gaze as though it was something that you hadn't ought to hear about or hadn't ought to see. And those who are honest with themselves are going to dispassionately examine the evidence. We've got to, if we're going to be true to our calling as scientists.
There has been a polarization of ideas. Elaine Morgan and certain others have sought for every scrap of evidence they could find to support the aquatic theory. Some of the more conservative anthropologists have searched for every scrap of information they can find to destroy that theory. And so, instead of having a balanced judgment, what you've got is a counsel for the defense and a counsel for the prosecution.
I think that people going in for science today do it because they love it. They wouldn't be going into it for the money. They hope they've got something to contribute, and they are afraid that they would lessen their chances of contributing if they openly supported a crackpot heresy like this. They may be right. I would not advise anybody to lay their careers on the line over this issue. If it is sound, it will prevail anyway, and if it's not sound, it doesn't deserve to. Thank you very much.
Elaine Morgan may not be putting her career on the line, but in her 30-year pursuit of the truth, she has taken an idea that was on the far edge of science and pushed it into the spotlight. She has looked at the research into the human body as much as at the studies of the long-dead bones, and has come to some of her conclusions simply because they made sense. Did humanity rise out of water? It has to be considered.